I stood there while my father explained why my brother deserved the house and the company I helped build, and in that moment, I realized the truth hurts less than lies spoken gently, because betrayal whispered with love still cuts deep, but it also wakes you up in ways comfort never will. My name is Alice. And when my father asked us to sit down at the dining table that afternoon, I told myself this was just another discussion about schedules, expansion plans, or future goals, because hope had trained me to soften reality before it could hurt. This won't take long, my father said, folding his hands and clearing his throat, and I noticed how his eyes stayed on Ethan instead of moving around the room. Ethan leaned back and said, "Just say it, Dad," like he already knew the ending, and my stomach tightened at his tone. My mother kept adjusting her ring and said nothing, and that silence felt louder than words. My father finally said, "I've decided the house and the company will go to Ethan," and the sentence landed cleanly, without apology or pause. I waited, counting seconds in my head, expecting my name to follow, expecting balance, expecting acknowledgement. "And me?" I asked quietly, because my voice had learned to be careful. My father looked at me and said, "Alice, you've been incredibly loyal and supportive," and the word supportive felt like being thanked for holding the door while someone else walked through. Ethan smiled and said, "You'll still be part of things," as if inclusion was a gift he could offer. I said, "I helped build this," and my father replied, "And you did a great job," without answering what I actually asked. My mother whispered, "Please don't turn this into an argument," and I realized she was already choosing peace over truth. I looked at Ethan and said, "Did you know?" And he shrugged before saying, "It made sense," like fairness had never been part of the equation. My father added, "Leadership requires a certain presence," and I asked, "Is that something I lack?" even though my hands were shaking. He paused and said, "This isn't about you," which somehow made it entirely about me. I remembered staying late at the office while Ethan left early, remembering believing effort would eventually be noticed. Ethan said, "You're better behind the scenes," and I wondered when invisible became a role. I said, "I shaped my life around this place," and my father answered, "Sacrifice doesn't always lead to ownership," like it was a lesson I should thank him for. The room felt smaller as the conversation ended, and no one asked how I felt. My mother finally said, "We love you," and I nodded because I didn't trust my voice. Ethan stood and said, "No hard feelings," and I wondered how easily he could say that. Later, as we cleared the table, I asked my father, "When did you decide?" and he replied, "A long time ago." That sentence stayed with me, heavy and final. On the drive home I replayed every moment I thought mattered, every promise I assumed was real. I called Maya and said, "He chose Ethan," and she answered, "I know," which surprised me. She said, "I saw it coming," and I asked, "Why didn't I?" Maya replied, "Because you believed effort could replace favoritism," and that truth hurt more than the decision itself. I sat on my couch and said out loud, "I was never an option," and the words felt cold but honest. I remembered my father praising Ethan publicly while correcting me privately. I remembered meetings where my ideas returned through Ethan's voice. I remembered my mother changing subjects when tension appeared. That night I realized the betrayal wasn't sudden, it was rehearsed. I whispered, "They planned this," and for the first time, hope didn't argue back. Understanding hurt, but it also steadied me. I said to myself, my name was never meant to be said, and that clarity marked the beginning of something I couldn't yet name. I didn't notice myself disappearing at first, because no one ever announced it, they just slowly stopped asking where I was. "Was there a meeting this morning?" I asked Ethan one afternoon, standing near his office door with my notebook still closed. He didn't look up and said, "Yeah, it was quick," like speed explained absence. I said, "I didn't get an invite," and he replied, "Dad wanted to keep it small," which somehow never included me anymore. When I asked my father later, "Did I miss something important?" he sighed and said, "Alice, you're reading into things again." I answered, "I handled those clients," and he replied, "You're letting emotions cloud facts," which felt like a way to dismiss both. Emails stopped coming to my inbox, and when I asked the assistant, she said, "Ethan asked to streamline communication," while avoiding my eyes. I opened a shared folder one morning and saw my name removed from a project I built, replaced neatly with Ethan's, like it had always belonged there. I went to his office and said, "Why is my name gone?" and he said, "It's easier this way," without hesitation. I asked, easier for who? And he shrugged before saying, the company. Claire started showing up more after that, standing too close, smiling too softly, saying things like, you seem stressed lately. I replied once, I'm concerned, and she laughed quietly and said, that's what happens when you care too much. During a meeting, my idea came back to me in Ethan's voice, and my father nodded approvingly while I sat silent. I waited until afterward and said, that was my proposal, and my father replied, does it matter who presents it if it works? I said, it mattered when it was ignored, and he looked at me like I was inconveniencing him. Support roles are important, he said, and I realized that was where he had placed me permanently. Ben stopped making eye contact, and when I finally asked him, did something change, he whispered, I just follow instructions. That honesty hurt more than a lie, because it meant my erasure was intentional. I asked my father, do you still see me as part of this? And he answered, of course, without convincing himself. Then why am I invisible? I asked, and he replied, you're exaggerating, which made me doubt my own senses. Maya noticed my silence and asked, why do you sound smaller? And I said, because I'm learning how not to take up space. She said, that's not who you are, and I replied, it's who they want me to be. I held old office keys in my hand one evening and realized they no longer opened anything. Files I created were locked, emails erased, decisions made without me. Claire once said, not everyone is meant to lead, while adjusting her ring, and I wondered when she decided that about me. I said to Ethan, do you think I'm incapable? And he replied, I think you're sensitive, like it was a flaw. I sat in my car after work and cried quietly, not because I was fired, but because I was still there and disappearing. My father praised Ethan publicly, saying, you have natural authority, while telling me privately, you're valuable support. I asked him, did I ever have a chance? And he paused too long before saying, this isn't personal. That pause answered everything. Ben finally said one night, I don't like how this looks, and I asked, then why help? And he said, because resistance costs more. I went home and told Maya, staying is changing me, and she replied, then leaving might save you. I sat on my floor and whispered, I don't recognize myself anymore, and saying it hurt more than silence. I finally admitted out loud, they didn't exclude me, they replaced me, and that truth broke me open. I woke up that morning feeling empty, not dramatic or angry, just tired in a way that made pretending impossible anymore. Maya looked at me over her coffee and said, you don't look scared today, and I replied, I'm too tired to care. She asked, care about what? And I said, about being liked by people who already decided who I am. Maya leaned closer and said, you used to fight for rooms you deserved, and I answered, I learned shrinking was safer. She shook her head and said, safe doesn't mean alive, and that sentence stayed with me. My phone buzzed, and when I saw Ben's name, my first instinct was to ignore it, but something made me answer. He said quietly, I shouldn't be calling you, and I replied, then don't lie to me. There was a pause before he said, some numbers don't make sense, and my chest tightened. I asked, what kind of numbers? And he whispered, the kind hidden on purpose. Maya watched my face and said, this is important, and I nodded slowly. Ben said, I don't feel right about this, and I replied, then help me understand it. He emailed files later that afternoon, and as I scrolled through them, I said out loud, this doesn't add up. Maya asked, is it bad? And I said, it's careful, and that scared me more. I stared at the screen and whispered, he built everything on silence. Maya said, you don't owe them protection, and I replied, I know, even though my hands shook. That evening I sat outside a law office and told myself, this is just information. Sarah opened the door and said, take your time, and I immediately trusted her calm. She asked, why are you here? And I answered, I need the truth, not revenge. Sarah nodded and said, truth has consequences, and I replied, so does silence. I explained everything without interruption, and when I finished she said, you're not imagining this. That validation felt heavier than anger. When I left, I sat in my car and whispered, I'm allowed to know. The next night I went to my father's house and said, I need to speak to you alone. He sighed and replied, this again, and I said, no, this ends tonight. I placed the documents on the table and said, explain these. He glanced at them and said, you don't understand business, and I answered, then explain it. He looked away and said, Ethan handles pressure better, and I replied, or he's protected more. Silence filled the room. My father said, you're tearing this family apart, and I answered, you already did. My mother appeared and whispered, please stop, and I said, I can't disappear anymore. My father said, if you walk out, don't come back, and I replied, I already left. I walked outside shaking but steady, breathing air that felt honest for the first time. Maya called and asked, did you do it? And I said, I chose myself. She replied, that's not rebellion, and I said, it's survival. I sat alone later and whispered, I don't need permission to exist. For the first time, distance felt safer than hope, and I learned the truth does not arrive loudly, it slips in quietly through phone calls that stop coming and emails that suddenly feel careful. Maya called me first and said, have you heard? And I answered, heard what, even though my chest already knew. She said, Ethan's name is everywhere, and I asked, everywhere where, while staring at the ceiling. Legal places, she replied, the kind that don't forget, and I closed my eyes without smiling. Ben texted later and wrote, I'm sorry, and I replied, it wasn't your lie. He called and said, they're asking questions, and I answered, they should, because calm had replaced fear. Ben hesitated and said, your father keeps asking about you, and I replied, he knows where I am. Ethan never called me, not once, and that silence told me more than any apology could. Claire vanished from conversations the same way she once entered them, carefully and without warning. Maya asked, do you feel like you won? And I said, I feel done, which surprised me. She laughed softly and said, that sounds healthier, and I agreed. Sarah called and said, the process is moving forward, and I asked, what does that mean for me? She replied, only what you allow, and I said, I'm choosing peace. I ran into my father at the grocery store, and he looked smaller than I remembered. He said, we need to talk, and I replied, I'm listening, without stopping. He asked, why didn't you warn us? And I answered, I spent years warning you. He said, your brother made mistakes, and I replied, he made choices. My father sighed and said, I was trying to protect the family, and I looked at him and said, you protected comfort. He asked quietly, do you hate me? And I answered, no, but I don't need you. That sentence felt like setting down a weight I carried too long. Later my mother called and whispered, I wish I had been braver, and I said, I wish you had too. She cried and asked, can we fix this? And I replied, we can be honest. The company unraveled without drama, through audits, resignations, and quiet exits. Maya asked, do you miss it? And I said, I miss who I tried to be there. She asked, and who are you now? And I smiled before saying, someone who chooses herself. I built a smaller life, but it fit me, filled with mornings without dread. I took a job where my voice mattered, and when my boss said, lead this, I believed him. Maya teased, look at you, and I replied, I was always here. Sometimes I passed the old house and felt nothing but distance. I said to myself, he kept the house, and then added, but I kept the truth. When Ethan's name stopped meaning power, I didn't celebrate. My father sent a message that said, I'm proud of you, and I read it without answering. Not because I was cruel, but because I was complete. Maya asked, do you forgive them? And I said, I forgive myself. At night I whispered, I survived, and the words felt steady. I learned revenge is loud, but freedom is quiet, and I chose quiet. One afternoon Ben met me for coffee and said, I should have spoken sooner, and I replied, you spoke when you could. He said, Ethan is panicking, and I answered, fear grows when truth shows up. Ben asked, are you okay? And I said, I am clearer than I've ever been. Maya joined us and said, you look lighter, and I replied, I stopped carrying lies. She asked, do you regret leaving? And I said, I regret staying silent. Sarah emailed and wrote, this chapter is closing, and I whispered, good. My father called again and said, I should have listened, and I answered, listening isn't the same as changing. He said, I wanted peace, and I replied, peace built on silence never lasts. He asked, what do you want from me? And I said, nothing I should have begged for. That night I cooked dinner slowly, enjoying the quiet, realizing no one was waiting for me to fail. Maya texted, proud of you, and I answered, I'm proud of me too. I sat by the window and said aloud, "I choose truth," and the room felt calm. I no longer rehearsed conversations or imagined proving myself. I slept deeply for the first time in years. When morning came, I smiled without forcing it, knowing I did not lose anything that was ever meant for me. Freedom finally felt real, earned, and mine.